Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to be talking about the new formation that we've been using this spring with our 9v9 group. Hopefully you can take some of this stuff back to your team to get better. So let's go. If you guys have followed a lot of my 9v9 content in the past, you'll know that my preferred formation is a 4-3-1. A 4-3-1 has a 4-man backline with 2 center backs and 2 wing backs. You have a holding 6, 2 attacking center midfielders, and a 9. And we've been playing that for probably 3 or 4 years now with the teams that I've had. This spring, however, we changed to a 4-2-2. Now, a 4-2-2 is the same kind of 4-man back line with your 2 center backs and 2 wing backs, but you now have 2 holding defensive midfielders and 2 strikers up top. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, why did we make this change? And the answer to that really gets into the disadvantages of the 4-3-1, as well as the advantages of a 4-2-2. First and foremost, with a 4-3-1, you have to have a really strong 6. That player is responsible for defensive coverage all over the field. And at this age, it can be very difficult to find a player like that. Even if you do find a player like that, they can still struggle to cover the whole width of the field. Another disadvantage of the 4-3-1 is you only have 1 up top. So whether you're playing a mid block or even if you're high pressing, it puts a lot of pressure on that particular striker to cover the entire width of the field unless you have a system where somebody steps. And at this age, it can be really difficult for them to grasp some of these defensive concepts. So with a 4-2-2, you get a little bit more of that defensive stability. Also, you're able to press or trap in a mid block a little bit more effectively because you have 2 up top. Some of that will become much clearer as we delve deeper into the 4-2-2. All right, so let's just look at what the build-out starting positions are for the 4-2-2. And we'll look at a couple different presses, but just in general, this is the starting positions. You've got your 2 center backs touching the 18 here. Your wing backs, your full backs are high and wide to start. The double pivot here, the 6 and the 8, it's important that they stay central and they don't get too far wide. And they're going to want to start high. And then again, the 9 and the 10 here also start high and central. So we're going to just start here with, what we do see quite a bit, which is a 3-2-3, which is 1 up top. But we'll also take a look at what it looks like when there's 2 up top in a high press, because we certainly have been seeing that quite a bit. You'll see here that the initial ball goes over to the right center back, so the number 4. The first thing that you need to recognize here is that the defensive center midfielder on the opposite side, so here the 8, checks in to the pivot spot, okay? The 6 has got to be careful to stay high. So what you're getting here is a pseudo diamond between the 4, the 2, the 6, and the 8. The 6 is really just kind of stay where they are, maybe just move a little bit wide, but they don't want to get too wide and bring that defender over here. The 2, the fullback on the same side, needs to come down to the level of the defender. And you can see that the 9 and the 10 are just shifting over to that side. The 10 being high, almost parallel with the center back here, and the 9 sliding into the middle of the field. So I like to think about both build out and attack as to, are we wide or are we central? So the ball goes wide here and it goes to our 2. The 6 can now slide in to this spot here, depending on what is going on with the 7 and the 9. Right? They just have to be in this area. The 8 needs to stay central in the pivot spot, okay? And you'll see why that's important in a minute. What oftentimes will happen, and you really have to coach it, is your 8 will get too wide, and then all the space will close down. You will see here that the 10 is sliding into a space where if the 2 has room and is closed off, can play that 10 in. But let's say that that's closed off, right? So the options the 2 has here would have been the 10, could play the 6, or could switch it back to the 4, right? The other option would be a big ball up to the 9, or if they can play a ball through into the 8, but those are higher risk passes. What you'll see here with this double pivot is they often will act with one another. So in this scenario, the ball will be played to the 6, and you can see there's immediate back to pressure. right? So there's only really through 3 spots they can go, right? They can't turn with this much pressure. They can either go back to the 2, which will, again, just close down your space. They could maybe go back to the 4, but it depends on where the 9 is. Or better still, what you'd like to do is combine with your double pivot. So the ball goes from our 6 to our 8, and you can see that there's back to pressure here again. And so this ball can easily then go over to the 5. And now look, when this happens and you switch the field, okay, either whether it be from the 4 to the 5, or in this particular scenario, the double pivots switch. So whichever defensive center midfielder is on the opposite side has to come down into the pivot, and whichever defensive center midfielder is on the same side needs to pop up to the top of the diamond. So this is where the switch will happen, okay? And you can see here that the 8 and the 6 make that switch. The 5 here can take their space, right? They can look to play a ball long, perhaps, to the 9. And that's a ball that we'll see, quite often. And then that's back to pressure. And then again, you get this combination between the 2 strikers, the 9 and the 10. All right, so let's look at another scenario that happens in build out in the wide areas. So the ball, again, is going to go to our 4. And one concept that you can see, again, that double pivot's coming down, the fullback's coming down to the level of defender, goes over to our fullback. So one concept that we didn't discuss in the last wide area build out pattern is the role of the fullback on the opposite side. Ideally, they need to be shifting into the middle of the field. They essentially are going to be occupying a place in the midfield, and that will help as we bring the ball over to the side. And so the reason that we're doing this is to create an overload in the middle of the field in case the ball comes over for a switch. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Ball's going to go into our 6 here, who again has occupied that space. The 8 has stayed in the pivot role. We're able to get the ball from our 6 to our 8. And so now what you have here, because most teams, especially younger teams, the 11 is probably not going to follow the 3 in. And even if he does, that's fine for us, because then that ball could go over to the 5, and now you got a 2v1 on the outside here. What normally will happen is the 11 might cinch over a little, but now you've got, again, it's typically, this is 2v2 here, but you initially would have 3v2. Again, depending on what happens with the 6, what happens with the 9. But you see here now the 8 will play this ball into the 3, who's got a nice spot here, who can then either at this point take their space, maybe combine here a little bit with the 9 who's back to pressure, and then we get ourselves out. So guys, here's one more situation of building out of the back in a 4-2-2 from the wide area. So again, we'll say this ball gets played from our goalkeeper to our center back over to our fullback. So here in this scenario, the ball again goes into our 6, who's occupied this space here. You can see that the 8 has stayed in the pivot spot, but this time the 8, the red 8, let's say, cuts off that ball, and the pressure is more to the middle of the field. So they have the ability to turn slightly and play this ball into the 10. And in this system, you're going to give the 9 and the 10 a lot of freedom. So the 10 can really come down. And you can see here that the 9 has come over to support, and they can go a little 1-2, and we get out this side. One thing about the 4-2-2 is the 2 guys up top, okay, the 2 strikers, should have a lot of freedom to work together, to move all around the pitch, especially when we have the ball. This is going to create overloads no matter where you are on the field. In contrast, the double pivot have to be very disciplined. So while as we're attacking, one could get high and the other one could stay low, they both have to be very careful not to get too far wide and stay central, because counter-pressing is going to be really important when we lose the ball. So when we talk about building out of the back in the central part of the field, in general, we're talking about the ball going, at least initially, to the pivot spot. And again, the big coaching point for your 2 defensive center midfielders here, the 6 and the 8, is that if the ball is at the opposite center back, then that particular defensive center midfielder has to come to the pivot. So here you can see that the ball is over to the 4, which means the 8 has to slide in. and the 6 needs to kind of stay high here. If it were the other way around and the ball went to the 5, then the 6 would have to drop in and the 8 would have to stay high. But so let's just say here again that the ball goes over to the pivot spot here, the 8, and the coaching point here is, can I turn or can I not? Like, do I have back to pressure or don't I? Because if the defender has come with, you likely are in a back to pressure situation, as you can see here. So in this particular spot, really the best ball is either to the 5 or back to our goalkeeper. So you can see that the ball has been played over to the center back on this side, the 5, and you can see now this is the key instance here where the 5 can take his space. So when this switch comes, whether it comes directly from the 4 to the 5, or if it goes through the pivot spot here, as it has in this case, one tendency that players have can be to stop the ball here, and we don't want that. Okay, we've got an advantage here, and what that will do is it causes the 11 in this situation to make a decision. Okay, and typically they will step, all right, but if they don't, then we just keep going until somebody does step. So the 11 steps here, and the options would be to play that ball into the 3 here. If you can slide it to the 9, that's fantastic too. But you can see here we're just going to play the ball over to our wing, to the 3. The 3 then looks to play either the 9 or potentially the 8 into this spot. But this is where the 2 strikers up top really come into play. We really want these strikers to be dangerous and kind of come down and be involved. So you can see here again, the 9 is played in here. And again, you're dealing with a back to pressure situation. So in this instance, the striker and the defensive center midfielder on this side are going to try to work closely together. All right. And again, in a back to pressure situation, just like before, you can play it back to our attacking center mid, who can then try to play the other striker in, and we're out. All right, guys. So let's look at what happens when your pivot has space to turn, or at least get a half turn. So here the situation, again, the 8 slides over into that pivot spot, but they're not marked particularly close. So the defender's not come down, and they can either turn completely or even get it on a half turn. In this situation, there are a couple of options, but I want to start getting you guys used to what's called an S pattern. So when you have a double pivot, especially when you get to 11v11, there's an S pattern that can develop depending on what the pressure looks like in the central part of the field. So here you can see that the 8 is able to turn slightly, and while doing that, the 6 has come over slightly, and this is this S pattern that you're starting to set up. The 9, which would be the striker on the side of that defensive center midfielder, has come down, and the striker on the opposite side of that defensive center midfielder, here the 10, has stayed high. And so what can develop is what I'm going to show you here, which is an S pattern to build out of the back. So the 8 will play this ball into the 6, who then will, on a half turn, be able to play the ball into the 9, who can then play this ball into the 10. And again, here's another back to pressure situation. So a couple of options, depending on if you could turn here, would be to try to slip the 9. Again, we want these strikers to be working together in tandem to try to get out of the back. But in this situation, you can see it's just back to pressure. We play that defensive center midfielder on our side, and we get out the wide area with the 2. So guys, that's an introduction on the 4-2-2. In the next coming videos, we'll go over attacking patterns, we'll go over pressing and defending, and then we'll go over how you coach all of this. How do you train it? Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section, or reach out to me directly, and see you on the next video.